Hello, everybody. Here we are again, Grouchy Historian with the American Constitution. And today we're going to talk about, I think, technology is great. We're going to talk about the first quarter, week 4. Okay, here we go. Now we're going to look at the Declaration of Independence. Because here we are, right? As we talked about last week, the colonists have finally figured out that there is no reconciliation with England, or at least enough of them have, to gather in Philadelphia and start to draft an actual Declaration of Independence, right? They wasn't a done deal, but now because the British have sent an army to invade the colonies, right? The British land are sending a fleet and an army which will soon land in New York. Talk more about that in a little bit. And they decide that it's time to break with England. Okay, so let's talk about the Declaration of Independence. Some interesting discussion points here in this really fabulous book. Like I said, The Words That Made Us, highly recommended. So let's talk about a couple of things. The Declaration in Professor Amir and others, Professor Amar and others have said, tends to read like a legal argument, which not surprising since many of the assemblymen in the Continental Congress were lawyers or were at least trained as lawyers, right? So it's laid out as a legal argument. It's basically an indictment against the crown and parliament. At this point, more against the king, right? If you read the phrasing, he, they don't talk about they or them, it's he. They are basically thumbing their nose at King George at this point, right? Which again is committing treason against the crown, not something one does lightly, but they did it, okay? So let's talk about a couple of interesting things when you read through it, right? And I think it's important to read the actual Declaration of Independence yourself, right? A lot of people talk about it. Maybe they know the first paragraph. You're going to read the whole thing from back to front to back, okay? Couple of things to keep in mind, because of course the Declaration, as you see in your notes, has come under a lot of fire lately because it doesn't address people other than white men, right? Doesn't address women, doesn't address the native tribes, doesn't address slavery. So let's address each of those for just a second. Women, true. Women, of course, at this point had no political power, at least overt political power. Now, as anyone who has been married for a very long time will tell you, don't kid yourself. The first person a man talks to about anything important is his wife. If you've ever read the letters of John and Abigail Adams, she was quite the spitfire, and she took no guff from any man. And I wanted to read something to you. If you've never heard this, this is great. This is a letter. This is from a letter that Abigail wrote to John. He says, talking about as they're getting ready to write the Declaration of Independence, she says, do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. Oh yeah, she said that to John. So the principle here is that the women's interests would be represented by the men. And of course, she's saying, yeah, pay attention to that because you don't want to make us mad. Am I right? She's very right, okay? The native tribes were a little different. No, they were not represented. In fact, I believe they call in the Declaration here, they call them native savages or something like that. Yeah. At this point, the British had started to stir up the native tribes along the frontier. Both the colonists and the British were trying to bring the native tribes onto their side. So yeah, this was not a good time for Native American and colonial relations. So yeah, this had been a kind of a running sore point with the colonists. First, they fought the French and Indian War. They thought they were done with that. But of course, now the British are trying to make alliances with those tribes and unleash them on the settlements and the small farms on the western frontier. Slavery, well, there's really no good way to get around that. No, the Declaration of Independence, as Professor Amar says, is basically hypocritical on the true meaning of the self-evident truth that all men are created equal, right? Here's where we're going to see the first of many, many political compromises made over slavery to get the government functioning, right? And you can debate the moral arguments of them. People do, people should. But the practical political factor is, in order to keep the colonies united to fight the British, basically, I will say that the Continental Congress didn't even want to touch slavery with a 10-foot pole. At this point, South Carolina, who we will see over the course of the next few weeks, was already becoming pretty much the stickler on the issue of slavery. South Carolina didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want anybody else to talk about it. They didn't want anybody else to think about changing it, messing with it, doing away with it. No. And, North Carolina, Georgia, and to a certain extent, Virginia were the same way. So the colonists, the Continental Congress made compromises, right? This is where we start to see the ugly head of politics rear up, that they just didn't want to deal with the issue. And they didn't. They just left it alone in order to keep everybody on board to fight the war. This, of course, was a catch-22, because there were many times we're going to see as we go through some other lessons that the colonists could have started to deal with the issue of slavery and started to put slavery on the road to extinction, as it were, peacefully, without having to fight a civil war in 1861. But they didn't. They missed those opportunities. And Amar talks about these in his book pretty bluntly, right? The guy pulls no punches. He says the colonists could have done it. Early Americans could have done it. The early administrations could have done it, and they didn't. And they paid, and America paid the price in 1861. So, what else do we want to talk about? Okay, they had to justify their actions, read like a legal brief. Okay, the next essay that goes along with this, I included this because I thought it was interesting. Little tidbits of trivia that I found here. Let's be brutally honest. The only thing that the colonists didn't like more than the British, or less than the British and native tribes, were Catholics, right? They love to talk about popery, which I find interesting, since, of course, there was a Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence, and Catholics were, of course, serving in the war. But interesting trivia, the colonists took their Protestantism very seriously, and they were very early on equated their Protestantism, that's a big word, with their politics, right? He says here, they open the Bible to all and maintain the capacity of every man to judge for himself in religion. So individual interpretation of the Bible was just as important to the early colonists as the individual rights that they set out to say they maintained, as long as you weren't a slave. So if you read through this, though, it's very interesting because as you can see, and we're going to see in pretty much the rest of the course, if you want to be cynical about it, almost everything to do with the American independence, it's not just about political rights. There's a little bit of money involved here. It all comes down to the Benjamins at some point or another, right? Trade and the ability to, trade with whoever they want without British rules of British customs and other British trade restrictions. The colonists were ultimately, like all good Americans, were all about making money. Okay. The other thing that they, so this was, and we're going to see through a lot of the case law, through a lot of the pieces of the Constitution, that underneath it all, it's all about the Benjamins: commerce, money, trade, banking, finance. Yeah, you can't escape it, right? If anybody thinks politics and money is a new phenomenon, how do we have so much money in politics? No, it's been going around since, say 1776, okay? The other thing is, let's be honest, the colonists were fantastic politicians, and they could be more than a bit just disingenuous. If you read here in this essay by Samuel Adams, they were more than a little disingenuous about the French and Indian War. They're like, oh, Britain threw it upon us. We didn't want it. We didn't have anything to do with it. Yeah, the history of George Washington would say otherwise, right? The colonists were deeply involved in starting the French and Indian War on the American frontier, particularly our man, George Washington. Yeah, they were a little disingenuous here, not going to lie about that. Also, they're still way optimistic about their own military prowess. As we're going to see as we go into next week's lesson, 1776 was pretty much a military disaster for the colonies. The British Navy under General Howe with his brother Lord Howe lands at New York, pretty much kicks Washington's butt for the entire year. They capture Washington. They chase Washington all the way out of New York through New Jersey, and the Continental Army comes very, very close to disintegrating, literally in the fall and early winter of 1776, right? I would say that there's a couple of really dangerous points where, if you really look at American history, the colonists came very close to losing the revolution, right? If Washington's army had fallen, if Washington's army had disbanded or been destroyed, the revolution pretty much would have been over. And it came very close to that in November and December of 1776, as we're going to look at next week, right? But for now, read through the Declaration, pick it apart a little bit, look at all of the clauses, as it were, all of the charges, as it were, that they bring against King George, and then look at the essay questions that I give you and see how you can work them into that. Okay, so that's enough for this week. We will see you next week.